Okay, so the first thing to remember about what happens when we experience the stress response. When we experience the stress response, there is a change in the way that our brain works. So if you put somebody in a functional MRI machine, so it's the kind of machine that allows us to see exactly what the brain is doing when it's doing it. It's very cool. If you put somebody in one of those and then you expose them to stress, what you will see is that the blood flow in the brain changes. When we're in a normal, fairly calm situation, so for example, I have been writing this morning. So when I'm writing, I use this. Up here is what's called the prefrontal cortex. The prefrontal cortex is, in evolutionary terms, one of the newer parts of the brain. It's highly evolved. It does all the really intelligent stuff. It does decision making. It does creative thinking, rationalization. Anything sophisticated happens up here. So we do tend to use it a lot, not all of us, not all the time, and some people really should use it more than they do. However, the prefrontal cortex is a very valuable piece of kit for us. However, when the stress response kicks in, we stop using it so much. So the stress response is governed by the limbic system. The limbic system lives down here, right in the back of the brain, right up in the center. And the bit that we're interested in is called the amygdala. The amygdala does emotion and it does fear particularly. So when you are frightened, that part of the brain starts the alert, triggering the stress reaction, triggering all of the physiological responses that we know come with a stress reaction. So increased heart rate, sweaty palms, inability to concentrate, all that stuff. Now, when you put somebody in an fMRI, expose them to stress, what you will see is that there is a reduced blood flow up here and there is an increased blood flow down here. So now we are thinking with our limbic system. The limbic system is great. It does fight or flight response. It is also a place where things that have been well learned live. So muscle memory comes from the lower parts of the brain. You don't need to think about doing it. You can just do it. So like driving a car, you get in a car and you just drive. If you consciously try to think about what you're doing, it suddenly becomes a lot harder. So when we're exposed to stress, we are using this part of the brain, this limbic system, this muscle memory part of the brain, which is great, but it does have some issues. Because what happens when we are using that part of the brain is we are good at doing things that we have done before. When people leave a burning building, generally they leave the way they came in. Even if there is a closer exit, they will go out the way they came in because they have a muscle memory for that. When we train people to perform in high threat situations, we train muscle memory. So part of my job, vast part of my job, was to train police firearms officers and NATO forces. And what we would do is we would train behaviors into them so that they could still perform when they were in a really stressful situation. So to do that, you make behavior into muscle memory. So you train it again and again and again until finally that officer or that soldier hits the point at which they can do these things without thinking about them. And the reason we do that is, just like we said, because the prefrontal cortex, when you're under threat, is not likely to be performing at its best. So you want something that will still work when you are stressed out. The problem we have with that is that when we train that behavior, we then have no way of analyzing it when we are performing it. So when we are stressed, performing that behavior is fine, but assessing what we are doing comes from the prefrontal cortex. So if we are stressed out, we can't do it. The best example I have for you is one that has terrified firearms officers across the country. We have a firearms officer learning how to disarm a subject. So he's brand new, shiny, out of the box firearms officer. They're all in a big gym, nice thick mats, you know, joggers, pretend plastic guns, and they're working in pairs. And so the aim of the game is that they will learn how to reach over and disarm the subject. So they do, and they do the procedure, and then they give the gun back and they start again, and then they do the procedure and they give the gun back and they start again. And can you see the problem with this? The problem with this is what happened when that firearms officer went out to a live job. When he found himself involved in an armed robbery. Fortunately, he had trained for this and was able to quickly and efficiently disarm the subject. Less fortunately, he then proceeded to give the gun back to the subject, thereby confusing the hell out of them. I should add a proviso that nobody was harmed in this incident, that somebody who hadn't been in that training room came in and dealt with it, so it was all fine. This is the problem with muscle memory. Whatever you put in, you get out, because the part of our brain that is responsible for analysing those actions is offline. It's not running the show anymore. When you acquire a behaviour, when you learn something well enough that it becomes established in muscle memory, it has to be the right behaviour. That extra step, that handing the gun back, is it now a critical problem. So it's really important to remember this when we are in a high stress situation and we do ridiculous things. The reason we do ridiculous things is because we're relying on the part of the brain that doesn't know it's ridiculous. It's entirely common. There are ways of dealing with all this, which we will go into later. But for the firearms officers out there, don't give the gun back. Thank you.